Amartya Lahiri and Ila Patnaik. So Amartya is at the UBC, University of British Columbia, and focuses on research is on international economics and macroeconomics. Ila is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi. She also works on open economic macroeconomics, focusing currently on the impact of foreign direct investment or foreign inflow on India. So we have, say, half an hour for each speaker, maybe say 20-25 minutes they speak and take questions, clarificatory questions along the way, and we may have 5-10 minutes question answer session at the back. We are running 10 minutes late, so someone should continue that way. Okay.
Well, I think
in particular, who gains and who loses, and what are the key channels through which these distributional changes occur. And, so now, India since 1980 is a perfect environment to sort of ask sort of a question, at least specific to India in this context, because of the dramatic changes that have occurred over the past 25 years. As is well known, GDP growth is sort of has been averaging 6 to 8% since the mid-80s, relative to the 3% rate that we had since 1947. And this sort of big macroeconomic sort of aggregate growth pickup has also sort of coincided with some sort of pretty sharp sectoral transformations from agriculture towards services and high-skilled sectors. Now, these aggregate changes have been occurring in the backdrop of a long history of social divisions in India based along caste lines, which has existed for centuries, and this it's been an endemic, widespread social segmentation in India. So we're going to sort of try and ask this issue of how do different groups get affected in the context of this, divisions along caste lines. You can ask these questions along various lines. I'm going to just ask this one along the lines of caste. In particular, we're going to be focusing here on SCSTs, scheduled castes and tribes, who are about a quarter of the Indian population. The key questions that we want to ask are sort of how have these historically disadvantaged groups sort of fared during this period of rapid changes? And can we sort of isolate some of the mechanisms that may be behind the changes that we actually observe? So, in this paper, essentially what we're going to do is, I'm going to, first up, basically the paper is going to focus on aggregate growth, sectoral transformation, and the gaps across caste lines. That's sort of the three broad things that we're going to try and bring together. To do that, I'm first going to describe some of the key data patterns, and then I'm going to sort of develop a multi-sector heterogeneous agent model to sort of examine the influence of aggregate shocks on these different groups, on the caste gaps in particular. So the data I'm going to use to sort of present the basic facts about what's been happening along these caste lines is going to be the NSS data. We're going to be looking at 6 rounds of the NSS data from 1983-84, round 38. Through till round 64. I mean, I'm sort of pretty more confident about round 61, which is the big one. So we haven't used the latest one that has come out. We're still processing that. But anyway, I'll sort of show you some stuff from the 64th round as well, which sort of brings the span of the study up to 2007-8. Our sample is going to include all individuals belonging to male-led households. We've done this for the overall set as well, but I'm just going to present stuff based on male-led households. We're going to restrict the sample to people who are in the age group 60 to 65 years, who are not enrolled in any educational institution, who are working full-time, and for whom we have information on their industry of employment and their occupations, their education information. This sort of cut in the data kind of brings the average sample in each round down to about 40,000 households, but about 170,000 individuals on average. So it's a pretty big sample. So here are the basic facts on education gaps between scheduled castes and the others in terms of years of education. So This is relative years, non-scheduled caste divided by scheduled caste. So as you can see, over time, from 1983 on, across the rounds, there's been a sharp decrease in the advantage that the non-scheduled castes have in terms of years of education. So that gap is shrinking over time. And that is happening. So the left group is basically collecting people by age groups. And the right panel is basically plotting the same numbers by birth cohort. So they both kind of reveal similar pieces, that there's been this convergence in the education gaps have been shrinking between the groups during the period talking about. What's been happening on wages at the same time? Yeah.
You're probably doing this to look at wages, but isn't it quite restricted to full-time workers only? Because that's an outcome.
Yes.
An outcome. So for education, for example, so if education is converging, if you include the unemployed.
Stuff doesn't show that much variation between the groups. I mean, I have the numbers in favor actually, so it doesn't show that much variation. We've actually looked at that kind of data. It doesn't make that big a difference. Here are the wage gaps between the groups. And this basically is, we've dropped 1987 from the wage data because for some reason there was almost zero rural wage data in the 1987 NSS round. So we don't know why that is, but so we dropped 87 from it. The red line is the median wage gap, and the blue line is the mean wage gap. So clearly there's been a decline in the wage gap. The mean gaps are a little more muted in decline, but there's been a much sharper decrease in the median wage gap. And in fact, by 2004-05, the median wage gap is basically on par with the black-white wage gap in the US. That's essentially what that number is relative to, just to put it in perspective for those who sort of, the other sort of big distributional gaps that people who studied a lot of the racial wage gap. So this number in 2004-05 is basically there. And actually, again, if you want to compare with the US, this number is a far smaller gap than, say, what you see between Hispanics and whites in the US. So that is a much bigger wage gap. Anyway, so this sort of the broad picture there is there's been this shrinking gaps in both education and wages. Now, this sort of has been happening at the same time that there's been this structural transformation that's been going on in the Indian economy. So these two pictures are basically presenting the sectoral compositions of the labor force of the employed. So the left panel is the sectoral employment shares by three broad industry groups, so agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And so the key thing that pops out, so the left panel is, the employment shares, the right panel is the output shares. So the pattern is more sharp for the output shares than for the employment shares, but overall they say qualitatively similar things. The service sector has been expanding, the agricultural sector has been contracting, manufacturing has stayed more or less in similar kind of, it hasn't relatively changed that much. So the big movements have been net outflows from agriculture into services. That's
Is this usual status?
Sorry?
What?
They're usual status, yeah. Now, we also sort of went, so what's been happening in terms of sectoral productivity? So there's clearly been this sectoral transformation that's been happening. But if you sort of cut it in terms of productivity of sectors, so you can do it by labor productivity, and we've also done it by TFP, by sectors, by taking, the TFP numbers actually controlled for both physical capital and human capital by running some insert regressions on it. The bottom line is there's been this productivity growth across the three sectors, a little bit more muted in agriculture, but there's been productivity growth across the three sectors, which has been happening at the same time. What's been going on with so coming back again to the caste wage gaps, the caste gaps, there's been the sectoral transformation that's been happening, there's been this aggregate growth. What's been happening to the gaps within sectors? Control within sectors, as it is sort of between the non-scheduled caste and the scheduled caste. So this picture essentially breaks the caste gaps down by sector. The first one is the education gaps of people employed by each of these sectors. And again, as you see, education gaps are decreasing sector by sector in terms of the workforce employment across caste lines. The right panel is plotting the caste wage gaps. And here there is a bit of a difference in the sense that the service sector wage gap has been decreasing, but the agricultural wage gap has actually not been decreasing, it's been increasing. And manufacturing has stayed more or less flat during this period. Yeah.
So is that related to technology adoption in agriculture differing across the caste gap, or selective migration out of one set up and out?
So it's a composition thing. So there's a between effect and then the cross. So both things are going on at the same time. This is just the end effect. So I'm just plotting the numbers here. So I mean, there are many stories that you can tell. You know, what may be driving all these things. So I'm going to sort of cut to that in this. These are just the data numbers. Okay, so just to sort of collect all these stream of facts that I kind of threw at you. Essentially, to summarize that, what we've sort of found is that from 1983 on, the last 25 years, we've seen the education levels and wages converging between the two, between scheduled castes and non-scheduled castes and tribes. This has been going on at the same time as there's been a structural shift towards services. We've also seen some broad-based productivity growth across the sectors. And the sectoral wage gaps have been moving in sort of asymmetric ways. Service sector wage gaps have been decreasing, agricultural wage gaps have been rising, manufacturing seems to have stayed relatively unchanged. And that seems to be a general picture of most of the stuff that's been going on in manufacturing. Manufacturing seems to be fairly flat in terms of both its sectoral shares as well as the gaps. Nothing much seems to be going on there. Most of the action is in either agriculture or in services. So the question that we wanted to ask is, so this is part of a broader project, so we've been looking at the data for a long time. So the key question was, of course, how to explain what exactly is driving these sort of wage gaps over time. That is sort of the big question. So we have a number of candidate stories that one could potentially investigate. And so, as I said, this is part of a longer project, so we're sort of going to sequentially go through a few of those. What I'm going to do today is to explore one potential margin to see how far that can get us, or does that have any potential at all? Partly because it's been the big thing that has happened in India over the past 25 years, which is the role of aggregate shocks. So aggregate from the perspective of these groups, that there's been this aggregate reform that has happened in the Indian economy since the 1980s. So the question we want to ask is, could these aggregate shocks potentially explain what's been happening in terms of the caste convergence? Now, if that is to happen, somehow it has to affect the caste differential for the caste wage gaps to respond to aggregate shocks. The castes have to be affected differentially. So we need to sort of figure out a set of conditions under which that can happen. And could those conditions also be consistent with the sectoral dynamics that I put up above, which is that there has been this sectoral transformation that's been going on in the Indian economy at the same time, where people have been released from agriculture, they're moving into the service sector. So that is sort of going on at the same time. So I'm going to sort of write down a sort of a very, very simple model to try and see if we can put some structure to this, to try and understand the confluence of aggregate shocks, sectoral transformations, and caste wage gaps in one story. So it's going to be a one-period closed economy. It's essentially going to be a static model. One-period closed economy model with a continuum of agents of measure L. And it's really, I forgot what time we started. When do I finish? There's going to be a continuum of agents here of measure L. And S of them are going to be SCSTs, N are non-SCSTs, and some of them is the total population. We're going to sort of, each agent is going to be maximizing utility from a consumption index aggregator, which is this Cobb-Douglas aggregator down at the bottom. It's otherwise standard. There are three goods that agents can consume: an agricultural good, a manufacturing good, and a services good. H is going to be, since S was taken by SCST, so H is for the service sector. This is basically here. M and A are intuitive. The only sort of wrinkle in that expression is this C bar term that shows up in the consumption of agriculture, which is to allow for the sectoral transformation to happen. So that's a minimum consumption requirement in the agricultural good, because I want to open up the door for a sectoral transformation to play a role here. So that's the role of that. Otherwise, it's more or less standard. The endowments that each agent is going to be born with 1 unit of labor time, and they're going to sort of have an endowment of ability EI, which is going to be random across the agents. They're going to be drawing, this ability is going to be drawn from an IID process with the support of E lower bar and E upper bar. And that distribution that support is going to be task specific, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Importantly, ability is going to be productive in both market work and in skill acquisition. So both of those are going to have ability as a productive input. So now the key thing that I'm going to assume, so one has to take a stance on what exactly does it mean to be a task. So the key thing here is to have to take a stance on that. Again, various things one can do. I'm going to take a very, very simple and potentially controversial way of doing this. I'm going to say that the supports are different. So the lower support of the distribution of this ability from which of the SCSTs is always going to be below, is going to be sort of bounded above by the lower support of the distribution of abilities for non-SCSTs. The upper support is also going to be sort of weakly below the upper support of abilities for the non-SCSTs. Now, this is supposed to be a stand-in for all sorts of historical discrimination that may have been going on, which would essentially reduce the ability levels of both groups or of SCSTs at the time of entry into the labor market. So this is not to say that people are born with lower ability or SCSTs are born with lower ability, but just the fact that if you're born into a household for various reasons who are either poorer or their parents have less education, it sort of transmits into them having a lower ability at the time that they enter the labor market. Just the so it's a very, very simple kind of way of capturing it. Again, it's not meant to say that people are born with lower ability. It's just that by the time they transit to the labor market, they come into the labor market, they have it sort of it translates into a lower ability type. Okay, so the labor market is going to have 3 sectors that they can potentially work in: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. Sector A, this technology only requires basic ability. That's the agricultural sector. It only requires basic ability. Sectors M and H, manufacturing and services, are going to require some sector-specific skills to get into. But these skills come at a cost. So there's skill acquisition costs, which can be both task-specific and sector-specific in terms of what you have to pay in order to get skilled to work in a specific sector. But those costs are decreasing in your ability type. So the more able you are, the lower the costs are in order to get trained to work in that sector. Okay. So essentially, we're going to allow these costs to be sector task specific. Now, the production technology is essentially linear in ability in each of these sectors, with the sort of different productivity levels in each sector. Now that way of writing it is a very simple way of writing it, which has this interpretation that the skill acquisition costs are like an entry cost in this model. It's basically, you have 2 ways of thinking of it. Either it's an entry cost to get into and work in the manufacturing sector or the high skill sector, or the other way of thinking of this is that unless you're skilled, unless you take that training, your skills are completely useless in the manufacturing sector. You need to sort of repackage your basic ability to produce anything. So that both of those are equivalent ways of thinking of it. But I mean, maybe entry costs are an easier way of thinking of what this costs are. So the occupation choice decision becomes it's a discrete occupation choice. So you stay in the agricultural sector in terms of what occupation you're going to choose, as long as what you're going to make in the agricultural sector is at least as high as what you can make by working in either the manufacturing sector or in the high skill sector or the service sector. So that's the 2 inequalities. And these are essentially going to imply 2 threshold levels of ability, which is going to determine whether people stay in the agricultural sector, whether they go into the manufacturing sector, or whether they go and work in the high skill sector. So just a picture would sort of clear up. So the average cost of acquiring skills per unit ability is a decreasing function of this ability cost, and what you can get by working in the other sector is sort of, because of the linear production technology, is just flat. The marginal cost is constant. So those are going to determine 2 different ability types. Ability thresholds, basically, which is going to determine whether you stay in the agricultural sector, whether you start working in the manufacturing sector, or whether you sort of go work in the high-skilled sector. And depending on what the marginal products are, it could be that the threshold is higher to work in the service sector or work in the manufacturing sector. So that is a data issue, which way the skill thresholds are going to line up. But that's how it's going to line up. Okay, so just over here to sort of, just give you a gist of what we're going to do. I'm going to sort of specialize the problem very, sort of make it very simple. I'm going to make the cost of acquiring skills linear in ability. That's the alpha E term that I have. And I'm going to have a fixed cost of acquiring skills. And that fixed cost I'm going to allow to be both sector-specific and caste-specific, potentially. Okay? So that's the gamma is the fixed cost of acquiring skills, and alpha is the marginal reduction that you can get if you're a higher ability type. You can reduce that, and that is uniform across the groups. I'm going to make a second assumption that the markup, the fixed cost markup of going from skills for sector M to skills for sector H, that markup is basically cost independent for both groups. The levels may be different, but how much more you have to pay in order to go work and get skilled for the high-skill sector, that markup is the same. And I'm going to assume a uniform distribution for the skill. So now the linearity of this cost function basically is going to imply a very simple ability threshold relationship that the ratio of the threshold abilities to work in the manufacturing sector for non-SCSTs to SCSTs is just going to be equal to the ratio of the fixed cost of acquiring those two skills. So this is going to be true for both the manufacturing and for the high skill threshold. So the skill threshold is just going to be equal to the fixed cost ratio of acquiring these skills. So that just is the linearity that is buying us that. In this structure, if you want to ask the question about what is the effect of productivity shocks, I'm going to simplify the model even more, just look at a two-sector world here, so I can draw pictures. Potentially, I won't show you a picture, but it's just very easy to draw pictures here. Just think of now, forget about the manufacturing sector, just assume there are two sectors, agriculture and the high-skilled sector. Two-sector world. What happens if there are aggregate productivity shocks to sectoral allocations and the caste wage gaps? So that's the question. So just to allow for an aggregate productivity shock, I'm going to say the sector-specific productivities all have a common component mu. And so I'm going to just change mu, which is my measure of TFP, and just change it as an aggregate shock that's moving the entire economy. And so that's so the key proposition is basically saying that an increase in aggregate productivity for the economy is going to, first off, decrease the ability threshold for both types. Okay? So more people are going to get skilled. And second, this sort of reduction in the skill threshold is going to reduce the caste wage gap as long as the fixed cost markup for these non-SCSTs relative to SCSTs more than compensates for their ability advantage, which is measured by the supports. The first part is sort of simple. It just says that the fact that the ability threshold falls is because it's an aggregate shock. So a rise in mu leaves the relative gains and losses from working in different sectors unchanged. That margin doesn't change. But on the other hand, there's a minimum consumption of agriculture, so a higher mu now creates excess supply of the agricultural good, and that in turn leads to a drop in its relative price, or a higher relative price of the service sector good. So it becomes more lucrative to work in the service sector, so more people begin to get skilled to go work there. So it's a very standard mechanism. So that's what leads to a drop in this threshold. What is the effect of this drop in the thresholds for the two groups on the wage gaps? Well, that depends on whether the thresholds are falling differentially or not. What does that depend on? Well, it depends on whether the wage gap is a function of whether it's falling or decreasing. Depends on whether the thresholds for the higher costs of getting skilled for the non-SCSTs sort of more than offsets their ability advantage. If that happens, then the skill gap is going to fall. Essentially, what does it mean for them to have a higher skill cost relative to SCSTs in terms of fixed acquisition costs? That's where these affirmative action programs that have been in place is sort of where society has tried to, the Constitution has been trying to give a sort of a subsidized education for them, and that's the role of reservations in this world. One way of interpreting differential fixed skill costs is the affirmative action programs. So I'm just going to end with the fact that if indeed these differential skill costs have been a key thing here, we can examine what's been happening to some other minorities that have had a similar kind of disadvantage. So one key group to look at are Muslims in India, who have also been worse off than the mainstream. Here are the gaps by sort of education gaps for Muslims. Non-SC/ST Muslims in terms of years of education, very flat over the period. Muslims to SC/STs, gaps have been decreasing. Muslims are more educated, those gaps have been falling very, very sharply in terms of education. What's been happening to the Muslim wage gaps? Well, the mean wage gaps have been actually rising relative to the rest. The median wage gap has also either sort of kind of stayed, basically stayed sort of flat. On the other hand, when you see Muslims to SC/STs, big decrease in the wage gap between. So SC/STs have been gaining, Muslims have kind of just kept on, or held on to what their previous position was. So bottom line, what we're trying to do now is sort of take this to a quantitative level, just sort of calibrating this model to actually see whether we can actually feed in the observed aggregate shocks to see whether we can generate the distributional changes that we've seen. That's where we are with that. Thanks. I have all the studies I've seen, and so I've been looking at these wage gaps since the 60s and 70s, which is the big thing to sort of compare it with a similar period of rapid growth would be to go back to the 40s. So that's what's missing here in order to map it to the web. I think that's an excellent point. But I don't have the data to go back. I mean, some people may have. I mean, so I haven't found the study which has gone back to the black-white wage gap to a period of rapid change. So the key thing here is a period of rapid change.
I was just curious how any.
But not to give you a facetious response. So here, when I specialized into a two-sector model, that's the only thing that can happen. Agriculture will release, and then the only other place to go to is services. To keep the manufacturing sector sort of flat, what is important is, so we can do it actually as well, as long as that second assumption that I've made, which is that the fixed cost markup of getting skilled is common across the two sectors, implies that that middle gap doesn't change. So therefore all the action is at the edges. That was the role of that middle assumption.
Normally that would be smaller for the manufacturing sector relative to the services sector, and that's the one part.
Right. But that's why that assumption was binding enough. We need more field. We can't do it with business.
This can't just be the entire story, and there might be alternative stories. And Kaivan and Mark have paper on cost and mobility and so on, and I guess they're not in the room right now, but but they have stories of cost and insurance and all of that. So I'm just wondering if you are going to expand the scope of the project to think of alternative hypotheses.
No, it's insurance directly in terms of things that, I mean, we did think of credit market access and so on, which was maybe differentially we provided. That was one side. We're also thinking of political empowerment as being a key component as to what's been going on over the period. And the third one, which is trying to model it, I'm not sure if I'll talk to you later, about the role of this expansion being in the service sector rather than the manufacturing sector, in the absence of institutionalized trade unions in the service sector relative to the manufacturing sector. This caste-based thing probably has a bigger role, bigger unions get much more identified with caste-based, which is sort of, I think, the Taiwan and Marx thing is sort of blends into that. At least one of their papers sort of seems to suggest that had a role to play. And so the service sector, which is more disorganized, was a more equal opportunity sector. So that growth might have provided for an easier transition out of agriculture for these guys. But that's, I mean, we're still trying to figure out a model to do that. But that's another one.
Well, if it is not divided or reservation, which should be provided to the disadvantaged group, whether, what kind of education, where we should have more of a scope of, inclusion of these marginalized groups. Rather, we have in our country across the board 22%, 15 plus 7, 22% reservation. Whatever be there, but because of this sectoral differential, trend of the gain of the LCST and the different kind of ability requirement, can we extend the model and get something about what kind of educational policy and affirmative action would be appropriate?
Factors and what could potentially go in. But I think a lot of these decisions are made at the margin. So at some level, if you think you're just moving up the education ladder, having something at the top end, so you're talking about slightly different things. You're sort of talking about total proportions as opposed to, whether it should be 22% or 15%. I'm not sure what, that is, that's just a population-based representation, but this issue of what kind of skills should be protected and others maybe we shouldn't be. That I think is a tougher one, and maybe there is something to be said for more skill-based or more polytechnic-based things as opposed to based on which one is growing. I haven't thought through it very carefully, but it's definitely worth thinking of. Maybe tailoring policies towards the expanding sectors. It's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, but yeah, there's definitely a role to be. To at least think about that.
Okay. Has already presented an earlier version of this paper at September London conference, and we've tried to incorporate the suggestions made, so some of you might already have seen a version of this paper earlier. What this paper tries to do is to ask a question that worries a lot of policymakers in emerging economies. A number of economies, emerging economies, still have capital controls, and one of the reasons that they do have capital controls is because they're worried about the behavior of foreign investors. Often they're worried about the behavior of foreign investors not under normal circumstances. So while the literature, including some of the work that we have done in the past, addresses questions like the Granger causality, does foreign investors or movement of capital flows, Granger cause movements in the stock market index or in the rupee, but they do so in a standard vector autoregression framework where the relationships are linear and all data is included, which is data under normal circumstances. Those studies, and we have found that in India particularly, do not satisfy policymakers. Policymakers worry more about questions like what happens when things are bad. So for example, if you look at India today, you would worry, are foreign investors exacerbating the crisis that we might already be facing? So is it that when we have a domestic crisis, portfolio investors, and the paper focuses on portfolio investors, not on direct investment. So do FIIs come in when they're good and they go out when times are bad? Sure, but at the same time, does that really make things much worse for us? So is it that the foreign investors are fair weather friends? Is it that our markets are so small, and that might be true of some emerging economies, that our markets are very small and these are big fish in a small pond, so they really cause a lot of price distortions in the market, and is that something that policymakers need to worry about? Policymakers also worry about whether a shock hits the US economy or a shock hits Russia or Argentina or Mexico, and because of that, does the Indian economy suffer? So is it that our economy is, through foreign investors and the channel of capital inflows and outflows, affected by shocks that really don't have anything to do with us, and so we get adversely hit by those? Also, is there asymmetry in the behavior? So policymakers like to think that when times are good, that's okay, but when times are bad, that's really when foreign investors hurt us. So these are the kind of questions that we try to address in this paper. Now we have a lot of a lot of data, a lot of graphs. So what I would like to do is, for those of you who might lose interest while I go along, I hope nobody does, but in case you do, I'd like to first present a summary of my results. Just give you a summary before I go into this. The way to think about what we do in the paper and the results we get are whether there is a Granger causality between the volumes of foreign investor flows and prices in the domestic market. Asset prices, money market prices, that is the call money rate, or the price of the rupee. So we look at Granger causality both ways. I mean, that's not the way we do it, but that's the way I think about what we're doing. And then what we find after doing a lot of stuff is that while if there is a change in prices, then that does pull in capital flows, or that does push out capital flows. However, volumes of FIIs don't really impact domestic prices, whether it's stock prices, the exchange rate, or the call money rate. So prices impact volumes of FII flows, but FII volumes do not impact prices in either direction. There is some asymmetry, and I'm going to show that. But that's really the way to think about the results that we get in this paper. Okay, so let me start with the measurement strategy. As I said, we don't just in this paper, as opposed to the earlier work that we have done, we don't focus on normal times. We in fact leave out normal times. We just focus on extreme events. It's a bit like Viralacharya's work on bank stock prices. He looks at the tail betas. So we also look at just those extreme events. How do we identify these events? We can look at the extreme 2.5% or the extreme 5% event. So it's not that we are choosing an arbitrary cutoff and saying if Nifty rises above such and such, or Sensex rises above such and such, that is an extreme event, but we look at the distribution and we identify the tails of the distribution. We look at daily data. So for most of the financial variables that we are looking at, daily data is available, and for foreign investors as well from 1999 onwards, SEBI puts up on its website, from the data that it collects from custodian banks, it puts out net daily data. After identifying 5%, so we end up in identifying 5 because otherwise the number of events becomes very small. So I was under the false impression that the paper would be circulated, but it hasn't. So when it does get to you, you'll see that there's great detail in showing you how we choose 5 as the number. If that is important for anybody, then these are the 5% tails. Well, these are the events that we then look at. Now, there's one phenomena that we come across, which is that there is a lot of event clustering. That is, you have 5-6 days on which day after day repeatedly that is an extreme event by our definition. For this version of the paper, we isolate those out. We keep them out of our analysis. Maybe at the later stage we will figure out how to deal with making the confidence intervals for those events as well, for the clustered events. But here we only look at non-clustered events. The data that we have is, these are Nifty, then to look at what's happening in foreign markets, we look at the S&P 500, we look at the VIX, that is the one of the options of the S&P 500, we look at the daily FII flows, which is from the SEBI data, we look at the exchange rate and the call money rate. The last two, incidentally, I should mention, were added after the comments received from Deputy Governor Sudhir Kokar on the earlier version of this paper in the September conference, that he said that one more thing that we worry about, or about the impact of the behavior of foreign investment portfolio investment is the impact on the rupee and the call money. So we've added those in this version of the paper. The FII data becomes available from 5th of January 1999, so we go back that far. Another important thing to notice is that we normalize the FII data, because if you just look at the dollar terms, then or at the data in just measured in dollars, then the series becomes I1. You find that earlier the numbers were very small. That is when the market cap was also small. So we have normalized the FI data based on the COSPI market cap. The summary statistics are presented in this table. Basically, we move to 5. These are the total number of negative shocks. So if you look at the left tail, then 1.5%, 2.5, and 5% of the left tail, you will find that there are 167 such days in this entire period from 1999 till 2010, for which the or 2011 August, for which the data is available for Nifty. So this is movements on Nifty. But then, as I said, there are many days on which there is clustering of these extreme events, and we throw those out. So what we take is only uncontaminated days. That is, if you look at a day where there is sharp movement in Nifty, and we make a window around it, our window is 5 days before plus 5 days after, which is what we are going to study for the purpose of the analysis here. Then we've left out days in which even during those 5 days, there were extreme events in Nifty, that Nifty moved a lot. Okay, that's our way of cleaning up the data. So what I say, no contamination, means that there is no clustering of events there. So we get 46 days, and on the positive side, when Nifty goes up, the right tail, we get 69 days.
Is there information in that from that?
On S&P 500 again, so similar sort of. So I think this is basically to show you the logic of why we go to 5%. Otherwise, you can take 1.5. That is very extreme events, but then your number of observations goes down. So 54 here and another 69 there, and similarly for when there are large inflows and outflows on by foreign institutional investors, as well as days on which the VIX moves very sharply. Now, turning to our results. Let's first start with the question of when there are extreme days on Nifty, how do FIIs behave? So the domestic stock market does very badly or does very well. What are we going to look at? We're going to look at the 5-day window before and after of FII inflows into the country. What do we worry about? We worry about, or what do policymakers worry about? Policymakers worry about that what if, because of FII flows, Nifty has moved just for that one day, and that was actually, it should not have happened. It's moved because of whatever factors because of which FIIs came in, but it's moved sharply on that one day, and then the next day it goes back. Had it been that it moved because there was bad news, so currently, for example, in today's situation, had Nifty moved because there was bad news on the economy, then what one should not find is that Nifty jumps right back up the next day. So remember, these are events where only on one day in the 10-day window, FII flows have moved sharply. If the way Nifty responds to it is by moving sharply only on that one day and then by moving back, that suggests that the movement of Nifty was not because of news, but it was merely because of that inflow of FII money that came in, or outflow of FII money, and then it bounces back up. So it's not market efficiency, it's not news based. And news may be, you and I may be looking at the same news as FIIs. So what we look at is how does Nifty behave in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as, very importantly, in the event window, in the window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So, if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So, if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So, if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So, if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So, if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So, if, the way Nifty behaves in the event window before, if they drive it up, as well as very importantly in the event window after. So let me just take you to the graphs that we have. So, if, the way we look at this is when Nifty does well. So this is a day. 0 is the event time. So this shows you a day when Nifty does well. This shows you what happens to FII flows before the day that Nifty does well. So this does suggest to you that FIIs were already had started coming into the economy when Nifty was going to do well, and it could have been driven by news elsewhere, and that they do continue to come in. So the FIIs seem to respond positively to price movements in Nifty. The second graph suggests that there is asymmetry. This is on days when Nifty does badly. On days when Nifty does badly, if there was symmetry, you would have thought that FIIs would keep going out. Now if you look at the confidence intervals here, they are around 0. So whereas if you look here, again contrast it with this where FIIs keep buying, that is not the behavior we see here. So on this one, we would say that price does impact flows. Stock market prices do impact flows. When the Indian stock market is doing well, it does attract foreigners, and the foreigners continue to keep buying even after that extreme event in the Nifty, even after a sharp upward movement in Nifty. Okay, that just describes what we see. The other, let me go on to the next. The second question that we look at is, what happens to Nifty? So again, now it's a question, you're reversing the question. Do prices respond to flows? So what happens to Nifty on extreme days by FIIs? So you could worry that, and in fact, if one looks at it as you're planning to for other emerging economies as well, and if the markets are very small, then this would be a major worry of policymakers, that in a very small illiquid market, and perhaps in India of the early years as well, that this would be a serious worry, that if foreigners are big fish in a small pond, then there is overshooting. Now, the thing to look for in this one would be that does the price, so even if it moves very sharply, where on an extreme day, does it fall back later on the days when foreigners are not buying? Whereas if it has been moved by news, then you would assume that after that the price stays flat, doesn't move sharply back down. So that's the kind of response that one should be looking at in this situation. So let's look at the first extreme events on FIIs. So FIIs are buying on this day. This is event day 0, and the Nifty was moving up and is more or less flat after that. Here, if Nifty had fallen down sharply, I would have said that FIIs moved the price in a situation where it was not warranted. The news did not warrant the movement of Nifty. It was because of the inflow of capital that you had a sharp movement in price and then it falls back down. Similarly here. So this flatness or almost flatness that we see and not bouncing back is both for good days and for bad days, suggests that the market, in fact, if you look at the size, FIIs today own about 13 to 15% of the total stock market cap of Indian companies. This varies. I mean, this is just a rough figure when I looked at it in 2010, and this would vary as things are good or bad. But a lot of the media reporting is often FII selling pushes down stock market, FII buying pushes up stock market. So, yeah.
You take it as a percentage.
Seem to be moving Nifty to levels where it bounces back immediately the next day. What the third worry that policymakers have is, what if something happens in the US? If something happens in the US, our Indian stock market is going to get hit because the US got hit. So, we are poor little us, sort of. We feel sorry for ourselves that because we've integrated, we don't want to get hit. We do want the positive side of it, but we don't want to get hit. Is that worry?
Can I ask you a quick question? So, because you sort of...
On 0, on good days, yes, when the S&P 500 does well, foreigners do seem to bring money into India. But when S&P 500 does badly, then at least we haven't seen evidence of them taking money out of India. The INR USD. Now, the market, if you look at the spot plus derivatives market for the INR, then today the size is about $70 billion. And the size of an FII outflow in some of the most extreme events is about 500 billion. So that's roughly the magnitude. So even if FIIs were to move all the money out, the impact on the rupee market is likely to be small because of the much larger, 17 times, 34 times larger size of the market compared to the movement that happens in the market. And what you see here supports that result. Similarly, for the call money rate, not a very large impact on the call money rate, but there is more to be done here. It's a very noisy series. So we've done this in the last month or so after Subhi's comments, but I think we do need to look at these a little bit more. And given that my time is up, let me just summarize what we have here. What we have here is that what policymakers in developing countries, emerging economies worry most about is behavior under stress. That is the question that we have looked at in this paper. We take these extreme events. In a way, what we are trying to look at is what causes what, and I'm sure that there is scope for improvement in our techniques, but as of now, the main result is that the impact of extreme FII days on market prices, not a lot, but when prices move, then FIIs do seem to respond to price movements in the Nifty. And as future work, we want to, one, look at the clustered events as well, and second, we also want to look at other countries, so because it's not adequate to draw conclusions from the Indian markets, which are quite liquid and large compared to some of the other countries. Thank you.
In one sense, they are not terribly important, because this is buying and selling in the secondary market. Not, I know that one can invoke Tobin's view and talk about real sector investments, effects, etc. But leaving that aside, so the other issue, which perhaps is more important, is the rupee exchange rate. And if there one can think in terms of safeguard against sudden outflows, then there isn't too much to worry about. There is a safeguard, as on an earlier occasion we have discussed. Yes?
This is for the rupee exchange rate.
Reserves, foreign exchange reserves is one. You put in credit lines, to come back to what I am talking about for some time. Then, even if there were fluctuations, there isn't a...
One can service. Or bring in reserves or intervene. I think we can have a big long discussion on that, but that's a separate discussion. I'd be happy to have it later.
So, I don't know why you're looking only at one-day movements. Is it a statistical problem to deal with clusters? Because the concern is that you're just looking at blips, but not real crises. And a crisis, in order to be a crisis, has to be protracted and at least a few days. So, and what is the problem with dealing with, let's say, 4 successive bad days as a group, and looking at it before and after?
So that's something which I've been arguing with my co-authors about, and they have convinced me that if you want to look at prices, then you have to give us more time to develop the correct statistical inference techniques. So I am on your side on this, that I really think we should look at windows. When you're looking at a 10-day window and for 8 consecutive days something is happening, then surely it's very important, and surely it's more important than 1 day. But I've been promised that we just have to wait for a few more days. And the next version of this, because this project is, as many of us know, is not the not finishing with this project, but it's work in progress, and we're looking at other things as well.
I mean, there's a long history of studies on financial crisis where people actually have been trying to exploit this identification of risk elasticity, which exploits the fact
that confounding range and the period. One day is actually an artificial construct. You can look at 3, 4, 5 days, but provided there is no other new calamity, then statistically you can do that, and in finance it has gotten the long. Your quality is Nitika, is it? He and I were at school together. He needs to retire for finance and pay
Actually, finance analysts, for example, they do most of the things in a one-day event.
Basic time interval is 4 days, and then do everything in 4 days.
I completely agree with you. So we'll fight it out, and you're on my side.
So I don't know enough in econometrics, but I thought you should redefine this thing as a 4-day interval, and you will get a much bigger.
So they're promising that that's the next step. Okay.
Okay. So let's conclude this session with this. Thank you. This is Tridip Ray.